Hi all, welcome to Chessadelic. I want to discuss the 8th match game that was played between Vladimir Kramnik and Anand during their World Chess Championship match in Bonn, Germany in October 2008. Now, at this stage, at this point in the match, Anand is 3 points in the lead, so Kramnik must try and do something today with the white pieces. He opens with d4. And Anand now does not push his d-pawn, but opts for knight f6. c4 e6 is played, knight f3 in d5. And so far, Anand has not yet touched his c-pawn. Now, theoretically speaking, it is possible that both parties enter the Moran line of the semi-Slav, which led to very sharp games in the 3rd and the 5th game. Both wins for Anand, but he now enters into territory that has not been seen before in this match, and introduces the Vienna gambit of the Queen's Orthodox opening here with d takes c4. Now, it looks a bit odd, because the main reason for black to play d7, d5 in the Queen's Orthodox gambit, of course, this move, is to try and influence the e4 square. So, in giving up the center, it seems though black is breaking some very old opening rules. And Kramnik now makes use of the opportunity to create this broad pawn center here, d4 and e4. But it will take white some time to regain the pawn on c4, and black now continues the struggle for e4 in a more modern fashion, namely with his pieces. And he now introduces a Nimzowitsch Indian move, bishop b4. Now this puts pressure on the knight on c3, actually pins it absolutely to the king on e1. So white must reckon with the capture of the pawn on e4 by the knight on f6. Let's indicate that like this. Now there are a number of ways of protecting this pawn. You could move this pawn out of harm's way to e5. You could also try queen c2 here, or maybe play some gambit line with bishop c4, etc. But Kramnik opts for another way. He also pins black's knight and plays bishop g5. Okay, now the immediate attack on the pawn on e4 has been stopped, so Anand now switches and tries an attack on d4 with c5. Usually black has a number of options at his disposal to try and fight such a broad pawn center. And in this opening, it's not really possible for white to maintain his broad pawn center. So now bishop c4. Now we have reached material equality, but immediately Anand now plays c takes d4, breaking up this pawn center here. Knight d4 is played. There's some other things we can see that in trying to reach his objectives, black has slightly neglected his development here, and white has better and more active minor pieces. So now queen a5 is played, putting some extra pressure to the knight on c3, and theory now suggests some moves to try and gain the upper hand here, or the opening advantage, as we say. One of the ideas here is to play bishop takes f6. Now that is a very funny move, because you might think, oh wait, after bishop takes c3 and the recapture, isn't white going to lose his rook on a1 or his bishop on c4? No, because in this case white will play king f1. And if black now takes the other piece, then white can safely recapture this piece here on c3. And now black could even make a slight mistake by being too greedy and taking this pawn here also, because after rook c1, queen a5, and a very interesting and modern move h4, with the idea of developing the rook to the third rank, maybe even trying to bring it to a g7. White would enjoy some opening advantage. He would be completely developed, he would have the more safe king, and let's not forget that this rook is also very nicely placed here on the c-file. White would have something to play for, and I think this would be exactly the kind of position that Kramnik is hoping for. Well, having said that, after b takes c3, probably black shouldn't take the pawn on c3. He can try to play against this weakness, which is not going anywhere, later on, and first complete his development with a move such as knight d7. And in this position he has very real hopes of completely equalizing the game. Okay, well, in the game, after queen a5, Kramnik did not choose bishop takes f6. But he chose here bishop b5, which is slightly less popular. And maybe he chose this because he felt, of course, that Anand and his team would have thoroughly prepared bishop takes f6, who knows. So bishop b5 was played, but I'm sure that Anand also knew what he was doing here. Of course he blocks the check now with bishop d7, and only now Kramnik exchanges on f6. Let's not forget that in a way this is a move that is necessary, because the knight on f6 is no longer pinned, because the queen on d8 is no longer sitting there, it has moved itself here, and in cooperation with the bishop is applying pressure to the knight on c3, of course. It would be possible, I suppose, to play bishop d2, but that would be a lot of a tempo. And also, if white is to have any kind of opening advantage in these positions, it is because of the doubled f pawns and the fact that sometimes black's king is not all that safe on the king's side if he wants to castle in that direction. So bishop takes f6. And yeah, now again, the more popular moves here are bishop takes c3 check and g takes f6. But Anand surprises Kramnik again here by playing bishop takes b5. Let's have a small look at bishop takes c3 check. There would follow b takes c, and after g takes f3, white could hope for some opening advantage with queen b3, bringing his queen to a nice outpost, protecting his bishop here, protecting his weak pawn, protecting this pawn, which means that only short castles remains to be completely in the game. Also, in some cases, white would even threaten to take here, I suppose, because if black were to recapture, then white could safely take on e6 with check, because the bishop on d7 would be pinned, like this, yes? So that would be a very nice move to play, and I suppose also a nice active position for white, and as I said, with some hopes for a slight opening advantage. Okay, and then let's look at one of the other options I mentioned. If black takes g takes f6 here, then I suppose the game could follow like this: castles, bishop takes c3, bishop takes d7. Now that is necessary because this bishop was eliminating one of the defenders of the bishop on b5, so this needs to be played in between. Bishop takes d7 check. That's also nice, the fact that it's in between, it is with check. So knight takes d7, and now b takes c3. And now for similar reasons I would not suggest that black takes the pawn on c3 because of rook c1, and white has some serious activity, but maybe the interesting queenside castles. And of course I suppose this is possible because there are not so many minor pieces on the board. Black would not suffer from his king side pawn weaknesses, and of course we have the open b file, but this knight here could move to c5, and it would be somewhat difficult for white to chase away this knight, and it would be very active there. Of course it would be protecting a b7, but it would also attacking e4 and squares such as d3 in combination with the rook. And of course, black could also try and switch like this, you know, and start up an attack like that. Or maybe in the endgame go for the c3 pawn, or play his king here and just try and mate white's king. So this looks like a very interesting position with chances for both sides. Okay, well, then what did Anand play after bishop takes f6? Well, he chose here for bishop takes b5. And this introduces the fact that white cannot castle immediately, because that would be against the rules. Illegal, so to say. So, yeah, Kramnik chose to snap off this bishop immediately. But he had another interesting alternative, which to my eyes looked a bit more testing, and therefore would be a bit better to try and gain an opening advantage. For instance, knight b3, just trying to disturb this setup of black's pieces on the queen side. Now queen b6 would be possible after this, and now for instance bishop takes g7, rook g8 and bishop d4. Now in between check would be possible, and after bishop takes c3, not rook takes g2, because that would give white some serious activity with queen f3, rook g8, and now queenside castles, but rather after bishop takes c3, knight c6, and yeah, now probably white is forced sooner or later to prevent the capture of the pawn on g2, so for instance g3. But after bishop c4, it would seem that again we have an equal position, even though white is a pawn up here. I think the main reason for this is that white has a number of white square weaknesses here, and we have of course opposite colored bishops, and yeah, both kings are in the center, but yeah, I don't know. It's a very complicated position, but it doesn't appear that either side is better, just apart from this pawn. I mean, black can also start some activity over the d file, of course, and yeah, maybe he just wants to move in his knight here and here, for instance. I think that is one of his main ideas in this position. So, but anyway, this also could have been a way of trying and reach a very complicated position, and to try and play for the win with the extra pawn. Who knows? Anyway, Kramnik chose knight d takes b5, eliminated that bishop. Now Anand recaptured the bishop on f6. And whew, white gets to castle. Okay, now that clarifies the situation a bit, doesn't it? However, after knight c6, I think that both games have reached an equal position. So now it is very difficult, going to be very difficult for Kramnik to try and press for a win from this situation here. Probably the best thing to do is to force the bishop away from b4, since it is still attacking the knight on c3. And why not do that as long as the other knight is also protecting the knight on c3, so we can recapture with that knight on c3 and not with our pawn, which would be a weakness, of course. So a3 makes sense. And now bishop b7 would be possible, of course, but that would be a passive move. White could even try moves such as knight d6 check, and then if you take that knight in order not to lose your right to castle, then queen takes d6, it could be nasty. Okay, you still have rook d8, but queen f4 could be on the cards. I suppose that bishop e7 would only add to white's possibilities, so Anand exchanges, which leaves white no other alternative than to recapture with the knight. So now the knight at least cannot jump into d6 immediately. Okay, well, there is not really a forcing character now to the position anymore, so Anand can choose a number of moves, and he first puts his rook on g8. Well, having said that, maybe one of White's threats was to play queen g4 and then move his queen into g7, so it makes sense that Anand starts with rook g8 just to take away this square here from White's queen. And of course also applying further pressure to this g2 pawn. Funny that he would also follow similar strategies in the third and fifth match games, winning those. But in that position we had this raging bishop on on b7, that whole long diagonal was opening, and there were more minor pieces, let's not forget about that. Okay, Kramnik, I put my rook on g8. What are you going to do? Now you have to think of a plan of somehow try and assault my position here. Okay, well, Kramnik comes up with f4. And I've indicated with a lot of green arrows that indeed this move does have its points. Now, normally one way to go and to play against such weakened double f pawns is to try and simply block them by putting your own pawn in front of them. And that is exactly what Kramnik wants to do. He wants to push f4 at 5 as far as his global strategic plan is concerned. Now, this has the added benefit that it would also block the fifth rank, so that his queen could go to h5. And from h5 it would of course attack the weak pawn on h7. It would attack the weak pawn on f7. So normally black pieces would have to defend that. And also f5 is very useful in the struggle for d5. Because if black were to push his pawn like this, for instance, then white would be able to jump into d5 with his knight and have a very strong centralized knight, making this pawn on f6 of course very weak, and sometimes also threatening to give check here, etc, etc. I mean, I don't have to explain you guys what an octopus on d5 would do. And also, last but not least, f4, f5 has the idea of exchanging on e6, which would open up the f file, and again, if that f file will be open, we would have some serious vulnerabilities here on f6. So all in all, a very nice idea which adds to White's possibilities. Okay, but it's Anand's move now, and of course he brings his rook to the open file, and he does so with a very serious tempo. He now attacks White's queen. And he does this in a moment that the queen still cannot go to h5. Very important, I would say. So, where could the queen go? I suppose the queen could go to e2 here, but then it might be vulnerable for the knight on d4. So, Anand instead opts for queen e1. Now that makes sense, because it is not vulnerable to the knight coming to d4, and maybe prepares to bring the queen to h4, where it can safely access the king side and would also be hitting two weaknesses in black's camp. Okay, but for the moment black has his own trumps, and he plays them. Queen b6 check, hitting both king and pawn on b2, so rook f2 is more or less forced. Rook d3 was now played, and mind you, now this queen again cannot go to the king side because it's blocked by her own rook. And in the meantime, black is starting to do some very serious centralization with his own pieces. Okay, now Kramnik plays here queen e2. Well, you can say, just a few moves earlier he could have moved his queen to e2. Why didn't he do it then? Well, because now knight d4, of course, would be answered with queen takes d3, because queen e2 right now attacks this rook here. So he can afford himself to do it. And now Anand comes up with a very interesting concept, yeah. And analysts and annotators all across the world were at first a bit surprised to see this idea and questioned it. And I must say, at first sight it doesn't look good, and maybe Kramnik has missed some opportunity here to put the pressure on black. Because instead of just simply retreating with rook d8, which by the way could start to allow moves such as queen h5, Anand played here the interesting and centralizing queen d4. I suppose that makes sense. If you put your rook on d3, you want to try and keep it there, right? But did he calculate knight b5? Which is a move that Kramnik could have played. And I'm sure that Kramnik immediately started analyzing this move once Anand had played queen d4. Now, let's have a look. I think that there are two decent answers to knight d7. The first would be queen d8. Of course, you have to safeguard your own queen from capture, and you still have to keep protecting your rook on d3. Now, knight c7 check, let's add this, would not be so dangerous because of king f8. And black already lost his right to castle, so he doesn't really mind moving his king. His rook is sitting nicely on the g file, and the knight on c7 isn't really doing much. Even though, yeah, that is true. Let's have a look at it. Even though he could try now to break the coordination, of course, between these two pieces, thereby attacking the rook on d3. But after rook d4, I suppose that there is no danger to white's position. Now it is his own knight that is in danger of being captured by this pawn here. And after knight c3 and let's say rook d3 going back maybe, or king g7 or something like that, we would have similar positions. Okay, well, rather after queen d8, e5, creating an outpost on d6 for the knight, which would also break the coordination between black's queen and black's rook, thereby threatening to win the exchange at least, and doing it with tempo. So this is a much more serious move than the knight d5 blocking move we saw earlier, because now it would be with check. Of course, Anand would be able to sidestep this with king f8, but now knight d6 would plunk the knight into a square from where it's not so easily evicted, because on d5 it was unstable, of course, because of the black e-pawn. But now the rook is attacked, so rook d5 for instance, which threatens, by the way, to win the e-pawn and also ruin the support point of the knight on d6, but with the rather mysterious, but if you look at it, very understandable rook a f1, white would be able to maintain an advantage, because any capture on e5 now, let's say f takes e5 and white recaptures f takes e5, and now for instance knight takes e5 or rook takes e5, would fail to rook takes f7 with checkmate to come. Also knight takes e5. I will show you. Now if black takes this, which is a bad move, and I will award that a question mark, then after f takes e5 we can see that there is a tremendous power unleashing against this f pawn. Now for all you viewers who thought that knight e5 would still be defending here, that is unfortunately not the case, because white can sacrifice one of his rooks, and after knight takes f7, as indicated, rook f7 is checkmate. So that would be one way to go for Kramnik, right? Knight b5, and after queen d8, e5, with the idea of bringing this knight to a very strong support point. But of course, after knight b5, it would be Anand's turn to think, and probably he would not have played that, allowing some advantage to Kramnik, but probably he would have chosen to continue his central strategy with Queen e3, eliminating both queens, which would seriously lessen any attacking power that white has. So then best would be for Kramnik to exchange these queens, and now try and take the d file with his other rook, which makes black's rook look a little bit stupid, but black can put it on b3, where it is, well, attacking no less than 3 white pieces, even though he can also take them immediately. But pressure is also very nice, because it means that your opponent has to bring in some defensive resources, so they cannot do other tasks. Knight c3, for instance, and now king e7, and now the funny rook d3, which threatens knight e5, discovered check, winning the rook on b3, king f8, for instance. And after rook d7, we note that black's rook is sitting here also defending his own b-pawn. So after king g7, and now, for instance, rook c2, with maybe ideas of adding pressure over the c-file, which means that black's knight would, under circumstances, has to stay on c6 and maybe bring in the knight to c5 via a4, where it would also hit, of course, black's rook. White could try to play for some advantage, but after d8, rook d8, and an exchange here on d8, the advantage is very slim. But I suppose that after king f2 it is there. White has some advantage, and probably more than he will ever reach in the remainder of the game after the move that he chose. And you could also think, well, if Kramnik is such an endgame expert, and if he likes to milk these positions, I suppose that still he has a little bit better pieces than black's counterparts. And let's not forget that there are some weaknesses here also, and in the long run, you know, they may pay out. I remember looking at some king-pawn endgame, that if you were to remove all the pieces, there are known positions where these pawn endgames are actually winning for the side that does not have the weakness. And that has to do with the fact that played perfectly and in the right order, and well, maybe Kramnik is a great endgame expert indeed, that this pawn here could become a very serious liability in these pawn endings. I do remember, was it Rubinstein or Nimzowitsch winning a similar pawn endgame with black? Anyway, you could try and look it up. I think it is all in all the elementary pawn endgame books. So this also means, and this usually adds some extra psychological pressure, that Anand in this case would always have to consider exchanges. Should I exchange knights? Should I exchange rooks? Should I exchange all the pieces? Because every exchange would possibly put him into more jeopardy because of his weakened kingside pawns. Okay, and well, to round off our discussion of this position, it is also not completely unthinkable that white simply has the better king in this endgame, because not only a possible king march towards black's weak h-pawn would be on the cards, but what about this march? Something like this, huh? Or something like this, when these pieces here would be in danger, right? So normally the king in the endgame is attributed a combat value of no less than 5 points. So if you can bring that to bear, well, you have to be very careful with black in these positions. Anyway, I'm not sure why Kramnik didn't play this. Maybe he just felt, being the endgame expert that he is that his advantage is simply not enough. Because, let's not forget, Anand is also a great defender, you know. But well, you're just playing for two results here. Yeah, it's just either a draw or a win for white in these positions, I would say. Anyway, these decisions are very difficult to make, of course. Should I go into this endgame? Again, I must exchange my queen. Okay, I like playing without queens. I did it against Kasparov and it paid off very well. But, you know, against Kasparov I wasn't 3 points down, you know. At some stage I was 1 pawn up, 1 point up and a second point up, and I kept exchanging pieces because Kasparov always likes to play with his queen. But in this position, maybe I should just try and keep some firepower on the board, yeah? Okay, so that explains why after queen d4, or possibly explains, I should say, why after queen d4, Kramnik did not play knight b5 because of the possibility queen e3, and rather played here rook e1. Now the idea of rook e1 is very simple. It overprotects the e3 square, so that now again he is threatening to play knight b5, because then queen e3 would not be possible for very simple reasons. Okay, but you can guess what Anand now played, of course. He played a6 and said, la di da di da, you can no longer enter on b5 with your knight. So, there we have Kramnik. What is he supposed to do now? He's a bit bottled up with his heavy pieces here, and somehow he should try and get an initiative going through this center. Files, the E and the F files, you know, or just over the H files something. Okay, now he starts by playing a prophylactic move. He moves his king out of the way, unpins his rook on f2, and by the way, let me indicate that also he unpins also his g-pawn. In some cases, these squares would be accessible for black's pieces because of the pinned g-pawn. So, in general, I would say this is a good move, freeing up white's pieces somewhat. But Anand now does his own portion of prophylactics. He now moves out of the e-file and wants to tuck his king safely in the corner. No more checks from any white knights coming. King f8. Okay. Now, you could think, why not try and push this f-pawn at some stage? Well, I suppose that at this stage it would be a bit too early, because, you know, Fischer said in order to gain squares, you have to give up squares. Now, the advantage of pushing the f-pawn here is that you give up this square, so knight e5 is possible. But, I mean, if you could move your queen to h5, it could be all worth it, right? Yes, it could be all worth it, but in this case, you would just simply lose the rook on f2. Well, okay, now that makes sense then, that Kramnik does not play f5 here, but rather he prepares it with rook e f1. Now both rooks are protecting each other, which means that the queen on e2 has a free hand. And now, maybe now, Kramnik wants to play queen h5 in conjunction with f4, f5, etc., etc. Okay, well, Kramnik, Anand is also playing, and he plays here rook g6, bolstering up his, bolstering up his king side. And I suppose that if now queen h5 were played, then he has king g7, which would not block the rook, which would then be sitting on g8, because the rook is already in front of the king. And of course the rook could maybe switch like this, you know, and harass white's queen. Furthermore, on g6, the rook is also protecting this f-pawn. Now, there were some commentators that thought, okay, what happens here after f5? And, well, I also asked myself that question. I don't think that it is a problem at this point, still not a problem at this point for black, because he could capture that. And now not rook takes f5 because of rook d2, and oops, white is in trouble on g2, but rather after e takes f5. E takes f5, which would attack, of course, the rook on g6, but after rook g4, I suppose the positions would still be equal. e5 has become available for black's knight. White's rooks would be somehow frustrated because they're only looking at their own pawn, and black could continue strengthening his position with moves such as, well, knight e5 of course, and king g7, and maybe sometimes rook h4, what have you. Okay, another option after rook g6 would be then to play queen h5, but as mentioned, king g7 would then be possible, so after rook g6, Kramnik didn't see anything better than to play g3, which at least would blunt the power of black's rook along the g file, sidestepping any tricks with rook d2. So maybe now f5 is on the cards, because in this case white would be able to recapture with his rook on f5, and then of course he would have double rooks on an open f file and would not be looking against his own pawn on f5. So it makes sense, but still this move is a little bit slow, and there is just not enough punch in white's position to create real serious problems for black here. King g7 was now played, and I suppose we should look at f5 now, but it wasn't played by Kramnik. Well, we can only try and analyze why not. So e takes f5 now. Let's try similar ideas here. E takes f5. Maybe rook takes f5 is still not possible. Let's have a look. Would there still be a threat here with rook d2? Well, this attacks, yeah, of course. Yeah, I think this is still good for black, because if we look very careful, we can see, of course, that this guy is attacked, but this guy is also attacked. And I was just very, what's the word, delirious? Delirious, I think is a word. I was just very delirious about the fact that white has two rooks on the f file, but let's not forget that black is protecting his weak f pawn no less than 3 times. And if he managed to take this guy, then this guy is also in danger, and it just seems that black has a very serious advantage here. So that f4, f5, and then a recapture with the rook is never really in the cards. Okay, well, so king g7, very cool play by Anand, and well, disappointed probably because of the fact that he can't push f5. Kramnik switches, and he plays rook d1 here. Okay, well, now Anand probably doesn't mind to just exchange some pieces, and of course after sorry, queen d1 is not possible because of queen takes f2, so knight d1 is possible. And yeah, now this knight is sitting here, so it would take some time to get it back here. We can imagine, of course, that well, black is out of any problems here. And maybe, in fact, he could try knight a5 here for some counter initiative. But he thought, well, my knight is sitting nicely, you know, on c6. It is supported by the pawn here on b7, so it is a support point. This also means that it blocks the c-file from any white rook trying to enter. And I suppose I can afford myself to play king h8. Now this move is a little bit tricky because of the yellow arrows I indicated. Of course, it puts the king on the open 8th rank, and it also lets go of the defense of the f7 pawn, and there is also a b7 pawn, which is the support point of black's knight. So in the game, Kramnik played knight c3, which has the idea, of course, of moving the rook to f1 and d1 and then immediately into d7, which would probably give him some serious advantage. But after king h8, he also could have tried rook f3 with the immediate idea of rook d3 and also rook d7. But unfortunately for him, after rook g8 and rook d3, queen c4 temporarily pins the rook, and the rook cannot go to d8 with check anymore because there is a black rook on g8. But after b3 he could try to do it, but then with queen c5, rook d7 could very safely be answered. Let's have a look at that. Rook d7 could safely be answered with rook d8, because taking on, let's say, f7 would be very bad because of queen c1, and we have a deadly attack on the pinned knight on d1. So unfortunately, again for Kramnik, all these ideas, they just don't work. So that explains why after king h8, which looks a little bit risky and also maybe a little bit pestering, Kramnik decided to play knight c3. First moving this knight out of harm's way, and now again threatening with the rook to come to the d file, winning in tempo against black's queen. Okay, but Anand sees it coming, and he plays here, of course, rook g8. And now after rook f1, which was not played by the way, rook d8 and rook d1, Anand would have queen b6 over protecting the d8 square, and we would have a drawn endgame in any case. So after rook g8, Kramnik played here king g2, and he still has a final trick up his sleeve. Maybe he already saw it coming somehow. Well, Anand brings his other rook to the d file, trying for similar centralizations as we saw in the previous game, the previous phase of the game. And here f5 would have been a possibility. I'm not so sure why Kramnik didn't play it here. Of course, it doesn't lead to any significant advantage, and maybe black could try and play queen e5 here, introducing knight d4, and he would still have a very solid position. Okay, well, yeah, we cannot look into Kramnik's head. Anyway, what he played also looks very attractive, of course, because now he gets to play queen h5. So now we see the extra value of king g2. It protects the rook on f2 now, of course, so the queen has a free hand. And Anand must now protect his weak pawn here on f7. And he does so very simply with his king, king g7. The king can save himself and his surrounding pawns. So now there was a check, queen g4, just a little bit of cat and mouse with Anand, who just went back to h8. And again, queen h5, queen g7, queen g4, king h8. And now queen h4, attacking the f6 pawn. And behind the f6 pawn, of course, the rook. But this rook is still protected by the knight on c6. So, of course, Kramnik could not hope to win this rook because he's playing Anand, and Anand is a very good defender. And, by the way, Kramnik would not even win a rook against me, because I would also see that the rook would be attacked, protected by the knight. Blah, 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 blah. Excuse me for this small sideline. Anyway, king g7 was played, bolstering up his pawns again. And now here it comes, the final trick, e5. Now I must admit, I think this is a very nice idea by Kramnik, because it is still not too late for Anand to go hopelessly wrong. The idea here of e5 is to very simply just enter on f6 with the queen and bring about a winning position in this way. But of course, black can defend himself, but he could have done it in a very risky way. For instance, if he would have chosen to play here f takes e5 and sort of try to accept white's pawn offer, because that is what it is a pawn sacrifice. Then after queen g5 check, king h8, queen f6 check, king g8, and f takes e5, he could go hopelessly wrong with knight e5. It makes sense, you know, to finally have this knight participate in the defense, snatch a pawn, be a pawn up, maybe bring this knight around here. I mean, the queen is also protecting the rook, yeah, so what's the worry? But after rook f4, attacking the queen, which has the function of protecting the knight and also the rook. So, for instance, queen d6 and knight e4 again attacking this knight. I think that black would be in dire straits. Because let's not forget that, okay, maybe it is possible again to keep both black pieces protected like this with queen d5. Excuse me. Then after king h3, sidestepping any checks, sooner or later this white knight will appear on f6. You know? Let's see, what do we think? Yeah, probably. Let's see. I think that after queen, maybe white is threatening things like this, and you know, just to try and bring the knight here, and maybe even rook h4, just crushing through. Despite the fact that he's a pawn down, but it was just this pawn that was blocking the e and the f files. So finally, white was able to make a successful switch with his rook and his knight. So after f takes e5, by all means, black should not take the pawn on e5, and I think it's a mistake easily made if you're in time trouble, because it's real difficult to just try and assess what is going on, you know. I mean, you need to have the flexibility of mind, is that the f6 square is weak, that the e4 square is becoming available after rook f4, and that also your queen is overloaded. It needs to protect both rook and pawn. So, and then just to have the calmness and the nerve to just play rook d7 and to protect the f7 pawn in this way, I think, well, excuse me, would take something from a chess player in time trouble. Anyway, after queen g5 check, I suppose the positions would be equal. But after e5, which was Kramnik's last trick, Anand wanted nothing of that. Of course he didn't play here f takes e5, which seems even possible to play, but why take any risk? Of course he played f5 here, completely blocking the e and the f files, frustrating white's knight and white's rook. They can never come to e5 now, or enjoy a nice life over the f file, switch to the g or h files. So we can now really see the final phase coming, and it was queen f6, king g8, queen g5, king h8, queen f6, king g8, rook e2, just a hopeless demonstration really, queen c4, queen g5 check, king h8, queen f6 check, king g8, queen d5 check, and after king h8 they agreed to a draw. So that was the 8th game. Again, Kramnik didn't manage to create really serious problems for Anand. I did like the way he went about it though. He was just, you know, waiting and then trying a trick, and waiting and trying a trick, waiting and trying a trick. But if we look back, maybe his best chance was to play knight b5 after all. Then after queen e3 exchange. Now let's just go back to this position, where after queen d4 he could have tried knight b5 and just tried to play this endgame, where, well, if we take into account his endgame skills, he might have had the best chances. Anyway, As my old chess trainer Hans Baumeister once said, you can only spend your money once. I suppose something similar is true for chess. You can only spend your 19th move once. And he didn't choose knight b5, but rook e1. Anyway, end of game, game over, it was a draw. Hope to see you again for the 9th game. Bye bye.